This is the interview with John Lucas starting now. Well, John, I think we got there in the end. So the first thing I was going to ask you was that originally you were reading chemistry, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And
Oh,
what's going on? No?
I'm sorry, the telephone went.
Yes, you read chemistry, but then you switched to do maths and rates and so forth. So how did that happen?
Well, I was a very keen chemist when I was little,
Yes.
and I wanted to know what things are made of, and I used to spend my pocket money each week. I'd go up, and we lived in Guildford then, and I'd go up to the top of the high street and go to the chemist then, and I had sixpence, and I'd buy various chemicals, and I was particularly trying to get hold of cobalt chloride, which would change its colour according to whether it was wet or dry, that it would go from pink to blue or something. And I didn't ask for it rightly, and got given cobalt nitrate, and when I heated that, it gave off brown fumes, which I now know was nitrogen dioxide.
Oh.
And I had many failures on that, but I succeeded with some other things. My elder sister donated her nail cuttings, and heating them in a test tube, I made ammonia, and that was very satisfactory. And so anyhow, as a small boy, I was very keen on chemistry, and could read chemistry books quite well. So throughout my prep school days, I was sick a lot of particularly inorganic chemistry, and quite naturally, therefore, when I got to Winchester, I was a scholar there, and in college I could make a choice after my first year, and opted very firmly for the science side, and again, a very keen chemist all that time. But towards the end of my time at Winchester, I began to ask a good many other questions, and I remember one of them was noticing something about the periodic table, and that I could a certain formula 2 to the x squared, it seemed, and wanting to know why the periodic table came to that, and this began to make me feel that I wanted other questions in quantum physics, but I was getting quite interested also in the various arts subjects that in a history prize. I began to get theories about the origins of the Liberal Party in Europe, and things about what was happening in Spain.
So then you started reading maths at Oxford, is that right?
Yes. Well, then what happened then was that I went to consider what to do with Oxford, and I was very kindly, many arrangements were made, and I was able to talk to a former scholar who was just finishing his time as an undergraduate and was already going to be a tutor, and he took me to see one or two people I thought of something called science breaks, and wanted to see about that, but in fact there wasn't. It had been an idea that had been put forward. All that would have been possible was to read psychology and physiology and philosophy, and that wasn't quite right. And he gave me the very, very valuable advice that I should read maths for a year while I made up my mind.
Oh, yes,
and although often I had occasion to criticize him in other ways, I'm always grateful to Marcus Dick, who was the person at Balliol who advised me to read mathematics, so as to get a year in which to make up my mind. and I was extremely lucky in going to Balliol to read mathematics because the tutor there, Jack Gillette, was a marvellous teacher, and I think he dragged me up from being a moderately competent sort of second order mathematician, and taught me so well that in fact I got a first. I scraped a first in maths and odds, and he would have been very keen for me to continue, but by then I had been taking a lot of soundings, and many different people told me that Greats was the best thing that Oxford could offer. And one thing which worried me quite a lot was one day I was lying down in the pod in the summer, the Balliol pod, doing revising some mathematics, and a much older ex-serviceman came and to what I was saying, and was very surprised that I was reading maths. He'd always thought of me as a great man, and that, together with the very good advice that I was getting from Durham, from the bishop and the dean and the dean's son-in-law, Roger Miners, all indicated that Greats was the best thing that Oxford could offer. And so I decided to read Greats, although my Greek was very, very inadequate. I had very little Greek from my first year at Winchester, my prep school, but I was able to get through Greats with and I got very good marks on the philosophy and the history, and very bad marks on the language. But that didn't seem to matter. I wrote my first and last Greek prose in the examination book, and it was a pretty bad thing, but that didn't seem to matter.
Well, then you came on to Cambridge later on at Corpus, I think, and so you had an experience of Oxford and Cambridge. What do you say about that?
Well, I used to say rather jokingly that if there were two equally irrational ways of doing something, and Oxford did it one way, then Cambridge would do the other. And this applied to punting and to the sort of dress worn at degree ceremonies and various other things. But I think the real was a whole sort of very subtle differences, and I came quite strongly to appreciate the both. And one of the virtues in Oxford was that undergraduates were the particular concern of a particular tutor who was teaching them, and would therefore be seeing them week by week, and just in the natural course of events could keep a fatherly eye over their welfare and spot if anything was going wrong. Cambridge is provided. Cambridge this was provided, and I, as a tutor, I was assistant tutor. I was trying to be in touch with undergraduates and be ready to be there for advice, but they would be taught, usually by a supervisor, often in Cambridge, in someone who was not particularly closely connected with them, and very quite frequently by graduate students who didn't know all that much. So the supervision in Cambridge was less good. But on the other hand, there was much more, as were tutorial concern, pastoral concern with them, and that made that had great advantages too. So I think it's very difficult to say that either is better.
Oh, yes.
Each was good in its own way. Each had its own defects.
Well, now the best known paper you got on mind and machines and Gödel and so forth. And
that went back a very long way.
You've got a paper on mine, machines and Gödel that caused a lot of interest, and later on it was supported by Penrose and so forth. So could you say something about what the argument was?
Well, the argument started when I was about 16, and at Winchester, that is, there was an essay society, and on one occasion, one of my great enemies wrote a paper which was of a very strongly reductionist kind, and was saying that we were nothing but flogs of protoplasm. And I encountered this by that if that was so, then we hadn't got any concept of truth, and he was putting something forward as being true, but was cutting off the branch he was sitting on, that it wasn't true, it was only that he was so constructed that he had to utter the sounds which I heard as his thesis. And that stuck with me very much, this sense that if you claimed something was true, you were going outside any purely mechanical or determinist view of the world. And when I got to Oxford, on the occasion when I was switching from maths to grades, again Marcus Dick, the man I said that there was some very recondite theorem about this all due to prime numbers and so on. And I just picked this up as something that I was quite interested in, and gradually pursued it. And while I was at Cambridge, I got as far as getting quite a good argument. I had a great many arguments with Christopher Lockett-Higgins, who was later Professor of Computing at Edinburgh, with whom I did the Gifford lectures. And in getting in these arguments, I was now formulating a general point that if one had a concept of truth, then it wasn't going to be possible to give a purely mechanical account of it. And quite apart from Gödel's theorem, there was one like Tarski that I had come across. And this is the background on which I gradually crystallized out the argument, which I then, after I left Cambridge, I had a year at Leeds and spent quite a lot of that in the Brotherton Library going over Turing's paper to the London Mathematical Society and working through that very carefully and finding a large number of typos among other things I should say. And that became the basis of my paper, which I read as a paper to the Oxford Philosophical Society while I was still at Leeds. And then I worked on it and finally published about two years later as Minds, Machines and Gödel. And I'd, among other things, while I was in Princeton, I'd tried the argument out, particularly on Hilary Putnam, and he produced some quite powerful counters based on Gödel's second theorem about the consistency of any system. And a good deal of the argument in Minds, Machines and Gödel was dealing with Putnam's counter and why we had reason to think that we were consistent, and that this then gave the footage, the foothold to make the Gödelian argument work. And that went on quite a lot. And then finally, there was a lot of further dispute, and whether one couldn't, at each stage, if I put forward an argument, couldn't it then be formalized and a machine be put forward and should do just the same as what I'd done? And that seemed to be quite a powerful argument. But in the end, I was able to use the Church-Kleene theorem, where at a certain stage in the transfinite universe, you can't find an algorithm to name every possible description of this argument, and in a sense you shake off the pursuit in the higher regions of infinity, and that really gave me the final point, and I've published various articles since pointing this out, and I still stand by the argument.
Yes, well, that's really interesting to hear that. Now, apart from a recent book you did was on Plato with the late Basil Mitchell, and could you say something? Was Plato the greatest philosopher, or is there some other person you put forward as your greatest interest in philosophy?
I would put Plato first.
Yes.
And there are several things where he went wrong, and Aristotle's criticisms are usually very good. There were occasions of Aristotle was clearly being tendentious and not really fair. But I think that it was Plato who certainly started me and started innumerable others thinking philosophically, both pursuing an argument wherever it leads, sometimes wherever it misleads, but always being ready to go a bit beyond and try something fresh. This is the sort of sense of there always being something more that I found very strong. And to draw a contrast between the reductionists who had a philosophy of nothing but, I call it nothing but, and those who always seen that there was a bit more, which I describe as modernism. And this is something which goes back to Plato and Socrates.
Yes, well, it's very interesting to hear what you had to say about philosophy and so forth. So I'm going to switch off in a minute, and thank you very much for what you said. And so now I'm going to switch off. Hold on a minute.